Yes, so, well, thank you in advance for bearing with my abstractions. What I'm going to do is very quickly a few kind of bullet points about things that I've thought about in relation to the last couple of days, and then a much shortened, I promise you, paper on the notion of hospitality, actually more than halved in the last few minutes. Firstly, a couple of things that I think, some of which I've already said, but just very, and other people have too, very quickly, that have interested me greatly in this workshop. Apart from actually a general thing about how interesting it is to have such a small number of people working together for 3 days, and what a luxury that is. Firstly, the sophistication of the models that people have been presenting, and the probable congruence of good therapeutic work, despite the differences around pacing, focus, therapeutic concerns perhaps. Those don't actually seem to me to be the key issues. Secondly, something that interested and surprised me slightly, partly it's to do with the very big differences that arise within each tradition, some of which have come out. I've kind of felt like I've begun to hear distinctions within the cognitive behavioral field, which my ear hasn't been attuned to in the past. And I know plenty of, huge, violent differences within the psychoanalytic community. But I also noticed, in my own mind at least, a kind of reversal as well. The usual model we have is, I think most of us have, is that the cognitive behavioral and empirical tradition is hard. It's scientific. It's kind of for the boys. And the psychoanalytic tradition is softer and more woolly and more romantic. And yet, when I think about this other model that's appeared a little bit, which compares the two, the difference seems to me to be around what you might call comedy and tragedy. Comedy is optimistic, tragedy is pessimistic. Comedy is often future-oriented, no, not necessarily. Tragedy is almost always past-oriented. And most interestingly, comedy ends with a marriage, and tragedy ends with a death. So in that way, comedy, yes. In that way, if we think about CBT as comedic, in a positive frame, I don't mean something to make a joke of, I mean in that frame of mind, then we're talking about something which is romantic and optimistic. You go into a marriage thinking it's going to work. It doesn't necessarily, as people know, but that's the vision. And if we think of psychoanalysis as having a more tragic vision, that death drive, the concern about violence, sex as a problem, drives, taking you over, then it's also perhaps the claim would be at least, the more hard-nosed and realistic. So I'm not wanting to posit that too strongly, but I think to me it's quite interesting to think, maybe CBT isn't so rationalistic in this kind of negative constraining sense. Maybe it's also got some romance about it. Fourth separate point is, I think, something that gets mirrored here, as does with patients. Patients come to see therapists and they want to change and they really don't want to change. Both things are true. And part of the work is on trying to think about what it is that makes them not want to change in the light of their also felt need to change. And in this discussion, we've had a lot, I think, about people wishing to be open, and at the same time, there's a kind of fear of what that might do. I don't want to overplay that, because people in this context have been primarily open to the possibility of something new coming in. But I think generically, that question about how therapists might change is quite as powerful a question, in the light of their wish not to, is quite as powerful as the same question we might ask about patients. Fifthly, I think I've tried to emphasize, and other people have, and I thought Anna did this very nicely before in your notion of images of knowledge, the cultural competence and the cultural capital required, but also the cultural location of different therapeutic fields, and our understanding of how we come into these therapeutic fields through these kind of social, historical, and cultural phenomena that frame us, but also make us responsive to some approaches more than might be the case with others. I was reading last night, I hadn't realized that the Tavistock, when it started in the 1920s, was known as the Parsons Clinic, because there were so many religious Christians within it. And in this particular article that I was reading by Masha Hewitt, she was arguing that actually the whole advent of object relations theory through Ian Suttie, who's become quite popular lately, who was a founder of object relations thinking in the 1930s and engaged with the Tavistock, is based on a kind of Christian supersessionism, which argues that love must triumph over drive. You know? And that linked with the kind of work that was going on in the Tavistock in that period. I don't know if that stands up to scrutiny, I only just read it, but I think the general idea that there is something in our culture at different times that changes the accessibility that we have to these different theories is really vital. That was 5.6 on this. Seventh point, sorry, yeah, the 6th point was my Parsons Clinic. 7th, a lot of reference has been made to translation. This always reminds me of Laplanche, if we're thinking within psychoanalysis, but even outside it, this question of what can be translated and what can't be. What is of necessity lost as you move from one language to another, and what is gained with different kinds of possibilities. There's a subtlety of language. One language might have a more subtle vocabulary to express nuances as another one doesn't. So some people find themselves liberated by a move into a new language, and others find themselves literally, as Ava Hoffman says in her famous book, lost in translation as they move from one place to another. And I think that perhaps is a really strong model for us to consider in the kind of conversations we've had. 2 more things here, and then I'll do my quick paper. 8th, there's been quite a lot of reference actually to training, but mostly around people's experiences of being trained and how that's formed them. And I just would like to put training back again into our discussion. It seems to me that it is the case that training involves both socialization, perhaps identifications, as you were talking about before, but also knowledge and skills development and craft, learning to do a craft as well as a kind of apprenticeship. Those models are all correct. Indeed, apprenticeship is often a matter of identification, as I see it anyway. So how do we help train people who are both feel secure in what they're doing, they know enough to feel like they've got some sense of where they begin from, but are not so closed out of anxiety that they're not going to know anything at all if they are subjected to too many contrary positions. I mean, in the 1940s, many of you will know, there was a big split within the British Psychoanalytical Society between the Anna-Freudians and the Kleinians, called the controversial discussions. And the resolution of that split was to have 2 different groups, the A group and the B group, and then after that the independents came in. And one solution around training was that although you trained in one model, everybody had to have a supervisor from the other group as well. And I think that probably held, most people, it's not just me, think that probably held the British Psychoanalytical Society together at a moment in which it really might have split apart. And that's only within psychoanalysis, but it's a model that people have, in a way, talked about, and perhaps we should be programming it more. And finally on this, and then my quick talk, I've got 5 or 6 minutes. One thing has surprised me here, coming from an environment in which decolonizing the university, decolonizing the curriculum, facing up to the issues around race and gender diversity and trans and so on, it's just top of everybody's agenda and is creating quite a fraught environment in the UK. Here there's been no discussion about race and very little about gender, and I think none about sexuality. And it's been a surprise to me. It's not that I've kind of felt it as an avoidance, as somehow it's been lurking there, nobody's talked about it. It's like been completely absent. And I don't quite understand that. And maybe it's because I'm in a very peculiar environment where I work. Well, or maybe you're behind, I don't know. I don't know what that is, but I want to put it in there because when thinking about hospitality, I mean, I wrote to you, actually, and when you first invited me, saying, this is a really great topic. Are you going to be being hospitable to Palestinian therapists as well? And you wrote back and said, that's an interesting question. And that was quite an interesting response. And it didn't happen, did it? I don't know. There may be lots of good reasons why it didn't happen. So this is not my attack on Israel or anything like that. The language of hospitality is being used in this conference to gesture towards an approach to differences in psychotherapy, in which alternative schools of thought are invited into each other's premises. The proposal is that this act of invitation will mobilize conventions of care in which the responsibility of homeowners and guests towards each other will ensure that civility dominates over hostility and that different life stories can be shared. This is an essentially Levinasian idea in which responsibility for the other becomes the primary ethical injunction, even in the face of antagonism. It promises a situation in which good manners prevail and differences are tolerated or perhaps glossed over for the sake of peace. This ostensibly allows a creative exchange to take place as the homeowner and guest inform each other of their differences within a context governed by strict rules of sociability. The paradigmatic situation is that of Abraham visited by the angels, in which his hospitality is rewarded with the promise of a child and with warning of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The drawback is that the concept of hospitality assumes a homeowner and a guest, with the imbalances in power and also in the comfort of being at home that this implies. The contrasting biblical examples come quite soon in Genesis. Jacob apparently welcomed into a place of refuge by Laban, only to be exploited. Hospitality in the encounter between Jacob and Shechem turning into a murderous bloodbath. An invitation born out of hospitality can also be withdrawn. The story of the Israelites enslaved epitomizes this, and maybe the whole of Jewish history. In the paper out of which this conference arises, Yael and Anne developed Derrida's understanding of hospitality in the context of psychotherapy integration, but also list some of the problems with the notion of hospitality. They offer a defense of hospitality in the light of these problems and include the idea that the host benefits from giving hospitality to the stranger through having their own identity challenged and renewed, the Abraham paradigm. For Derrida, they write, the stranger does not merely constitute a threat to the cultural community's self-identity, it equally functions as what allows this identity to emerge. After all, self-constitution always occurs in the face of the other. I take this point and also acknowledge the broader argument that the Derridian and Levinasian hospitality framework offers a way of thinking about how one group might reach out to another and welcome them in. In addition, as this expectation of gift-giving signifies some kind of exchange, it also suggests that hospitality might be renewed and reciprocated. However, the bigger concerns implied by the various difficulties listed, including one that Israelis will be very alert to, that of settler colonialism, but also attitudes familiar to those of us living in a UK characterized by official hostility towards migrants. The model assumes a host who has a home that they can share if they so choose, and uses the language of the stranger to other the guest, who is the one who, whatever their state of need or whatever they might offer the host by way of cultural enrichment, is expected to adapt. Refugees are supposed to be grateful immigrants to assimilate. The host decides who to welcome and who to exclude, and so on and so forth. We've talked about all this. Fundamentally, it suggests one group has property rights and the other is asking for shelter, which might be the case in many real situations, but is not, to my mind, the ideal. If a major difficulty with the notion of hospitality is the assumption that one party owns the space the other is being allowed to visit, then we might benefit from exploring the possibility of a more equal mode of sharing in which no one owns anything exclusively, but both or all parties have an entitlement to it. This is connected to the idea of universal human rights. That is, all humans have rights simply by virtue of being human and do not owe their entitlement to such rights to anyone. This is basically Hannah Arendt's concept introduced in the origins of totalitarianism of the right to have rights. And the reference to this is relevant, to Arendt is relevant, because of the alternative or overlapping approach she raises to the notion of hospitality, that of cohabitation. Cohabitation implies a sharing of the world simply because we live alongside one another. It does not assume a resolution of differences or a coming together or assimilation of one group to another. It asks for an ethics of recognition and non-violence that allows each cohabitee to share a space that does not belong irrevocably to either. As such, is based on an anti-colonial assumption that everyone has an equal right to the space they happen to inhabit, because ethically no one actually owns it to the exclusion of any others. is not that I own something that I can, out of an ethical impulse, share with you. It's that we both find ourselves temporarily in the same place, sojourning there as the Bible would have it, and need to live alongside one another in mutual recognition, perhaps turning guests into neighbours. In the light of this, how might we articulate a psychosocial understanding of what it can mean to come from different therapeutic cultures and to find ways of pursuing an ethics of cohabitation together? Anna and Yael warn against the dangers of the guest turning into an intruder and set some useful ground rules for the successful implementation of a model of hospitality in which psychoanalytic and cognitive behavioural advocates can encounter each other. The key idea seems to be for each school to open their doors to the other under conditions in which the encounter should be set up as a meeting between hosts who come to listen and talk with guests and engage in an honest debate, allowing for both disagreement and openness. They argue that adopting the roles of guests and hosts is likely to enhance tolerance to difference and disagreements. I wouldn't want to disagree with this. Setting third-party rules and reiterating the construction of structures for interchange that explicitly aim to reduce or bracket off antagonism is a standard and necessary mediation technique. But let's look at the current workshop, for example, which, although set up by clinicians trained primarily in the psychodynamic model, is actually one that does not invite CBT guests into a psychoanalytic home, but rather offers a third space that's not owned by either group and in which some kind of shared encounter is promoted. Even in the fraught and contested space of Israel, this is not so much an example of hospitality as it is of cohabitation, of acknowledgement that each group has a right to occupy the space of psychological understanding and the offering of help for psychic distress. This will, of course, also provide a forum for conflict and dissension, as must be the case where there are deeply felt commitments to contradictory modes of understanding and socio-political as well as psychosocial aims. While I've no doubt at all that Anna and Yael are correct in locating identity issues at the core of disputes over psychotherapeutic spaces, just as they are in battles over communal and national territory, it seems to me that third spaces in which no one is at home and consequently no one or everyone is a stranger is a better model for conceptualizing possible routes out of this identity preservation. This is because the space itself becomes an actively neutral one, disconcerting perhaps because it does not offer the comfort of home, but also with the potential to be both a space of illusion in Winnicott's sense and a space for witnessing in Jessica Benjamin's version of the necessary determinants of a relational ethics. The former idea allows us to imagine things differently in a playful manner that does not dictate identity crisis, but rather enlarges possibilities. The latter calls for a sense of ethical responsibility and of justice. That is, acknowledgement of the damage that's done through the hatred produced by clinging on to antagonistic readings of difference, and especially by othering those with whom we might be in conflict. To quickly add a perspective that comes from psychosocial studies to this, one of our claims is to be forging an approach that's transdisciplinary, in the sense not that it combines different disciplines in some way, which would be multi or interdisciplinarity, but that it provokes questioning about the nature of disciplines themselves by floating across and disrupting their boundaries. Transdisciplinary invokes a movement across disciplinary boundaries that's always restless and unsettling, or as my colleague Lisa Braitzer puts it, the trans in transdisciplinary suggests that there are practices, objects, methods, concepts and knowledges that do not firmly belong within one disciplinary field or another, but move among them, somehow beyond the reach of disciplinarity. Psychosocial studies lays claim to an idea of motion across apparently fixed fields. This applies also to the approaches we've been considering. Cognitive behavior therapy has its specific set of origins and assumptions, its context of emergence and rhetoric, and its capacity to respond to the self-reflexive activity of its psychological subjects, the ways in which people make sense of themselves, in part at least, through accessing the explanations for the experiences that their culture makes available to them. The same is true of psychoanalysis, which has probably been examined more fully along these lines, though this impression on my part may be a function of my own interests. Neither of these disciplinary practices are fixed in the land. That is, neither can claim to own a territory, as both are historical and social constructs that offer more or less persuasive narratives of experience, especially of psychic suffering, and more or less powerful ways of shifting those narratives. Once again, the model of cohabitation might help us here. How can we understand the processes through which both these disciplines have arisen and taken hold? What is it that produces their power and calls on the allegiance of practitioners and patients alike? And how does it come about that these contingent processes solidify into claims of an absolute kind, claims for occupation of the land on which they find themselves, irrespective of the pluralities that land actually contains? These questions demand historical and sociological analyses of both psychoanalysis and cognitive behavior therapy. There is no captivating truth to be found in one approach or the other. Instead, they reflect differing worldviews, sometimes overlapping, sometimes in tension, with practices attached to them that reflect these worldviews and in particular express the understanding they have of human subjecthood. This understanding can only be partial, temporary, or contingent, because as it's expressed, so the subject of consciousness shifts. We understand ourselves differently and enact our symptoms as well as our hopes, wishes, and fears in the context of the ideas that circulate. Cognitive behavior therapy produces certain kinds of subjects, and so does psychoanalysis. Cohabitation means expanding the possibilities for living alongside each other without the necessity of conversion or control. Which also means that as we occupy the land that none of us own in perpetuity, we cultivate it in our own way and let others do so too. You will hear the echoes, no doubt. We have our own small world of responsibility to think about, and that's the purpose of this workshop. But what we're talking about is not an isolated phenomenon.